In our last video about climate change, we discussed the way in which analyzing weather is different than climate, and why it's fundamentally an impossible task to predict weather. We learned that even small disturbances in the atmospheric conditions can have huge impacts. Today we'll be attempting to understand the urban heat island effect, which I will also refer to as the UHI effect for short. This effect contributes a small amount to the warming that we are seeing, so it is important to analyze. However, certain individuals have found ways to misconstrue what its impacts are on a global scale. Anti-science advocates believe that meteorological data from 1980 to the present day is tainted with a bias towards higher temperatures because some of the weather stations are located in developed areas. Their incorrect assumption is that we didn't factor this in or hadn't considered that variable. However, I can show you that we actually have. As one should with these issues, we'll dig at the roots and uncover what lies beneath. This belief is fueled in part by a single, poorly written paper by an economics professor and a climate scientist. This was no ordinary climate scientist. They worked for the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank designed to guide public policy in ways that they wish. This institute assumes a conclusion and then goes on to find individuals that are willing to tailor a scientific-sounding study to fit their needs. The individuals started with the data from the Climate Research Unit from the University of East Anglia. Within this paper, it details how far the temperature deviated from the global average from 1850 to present day. Within this paper, McKittrick and his colleague believe that an overestimation of the 150-year-plus average showed in the deviations from 1980 to the present day. They said that the urban heat island effect was what caused such a dramatic increase since then. They ignore the fact that within these studies, there is actually estimations for this effect and what it contributes. What this paper actually did was attempt to lead the reader to believe that their conclusions were correct because they gish-gallop with mathematics that is entirely unnecessary. This paper wholly neglects that we're speaking about averages here. This means that outliers in a data set are minimized as we take more and more averages. One could think of this as sort of a funnel. We take all of the data and we continue to average them until we sort them into neat little piles so that our brains can actually process the information. The goal of science is simply to describe in whatever simple manner there is. The contribution of the urban heat island effect to these averages is so small that it's already contained within the error of our data. Since it makes such a small difference, we could leave it out of our analysis altogether. But we don't, because we care more about understanding the Earth than learning about things that we can safely neglect. That's pretty much the basic premise of libertarian ideals. What can we neglect so that other people take care of it, but not us? In the UHI effect, areas that are more developed and have less flora tend to have higher temperatures than the countryside surrounding them. In fact, you might even say that this is the perfect example of how a simple arrangement of atoms can cause heating. The interactions are essentially the same. We still have a photon hitting an atom, exciting it. That goes on to jiggle around and lose energy. This is what we feel as heat. Of course, this means that if a weather station is located in an economic center, then it's going to read higher. It's a well-known bias that we continue to analyze, but it's also why we have various methodologies for discovering the temperature of the Earth in the past and today, because there's not just one way to do science. However, now we're entering territory outside of the scope of that study. They didn't assume that we had other techniques. They assumed that the bias for the UHI effect was large, and they assumed that it was never accounted for. So, by now, that paper is through. But let's continue to discuss the way in which we learn about the temperature of the Earth from the past to the present. Fauna can tell us a lot about the environment that they're in. So let's go back to our calcium carbonate secreting friends and figure out what they can tell us. This time we won't be looking at their carbon, but instead we'll be looking at their oxygen isotopes. Oxygen has two naturally occurring stable isotopes, O16 and O18. We can use the ratio of these two, known as delta 18O, to tell us about the temperature of the water surrounding these organisms. Whether they're fossilized or not, a tiny change of negative 0.2 parts per million in this ratio means that the temperature has increased 1 Kelvin. This ratio can also be analyzed in sediment and ice cores to determine the temperature there as well. This is thanks to the water cycle and can tell us about the condensation and evaporation of an area. If you ever wanted to know the equation, then it is T equals 16.5 minus 4.3D plus 0.14 D squared, where T is the temperature in Celsius and D is the ratio of O18 to O16. This was detailed by Epstein and his colleagues in 1953 in the paper Revised Carbonate Water Temperature Scale. Extinct Cretaceous cephalopods were used to recreate and reproduce lab data of inorganically precipitated calcium carbonate. That is exactly why a single cherry-picked paper from a so-called expert in something can never be used to discredit an entire topic, especially not one as complex and nuanced as climate change. Thank you for joining me, Witchlings. I hope that you're safe because you are incredible. I hope to see you again soon, and if you'd like to stay in touch with me, check out my social media, and if you'd like to stay up to date with these videos, please consider subscribing. Bye!